The morning sun cast long
We need to
shadows
move
across
now.
the Naval Special Warfare
Secure
Training
the
Facility
perimeter
in
and prepare for
Coronado
extraction.
as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell walked through the gates for the first time as an instructor. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 20 years of naval service. But today felt different. Today, she would be teaching some of the most elite warriors in the world, Navy SEALs fresh out of basic underwater demolition training. Sarah had spent months preparing for this assignment. Her background in naval intelligence and communications had taken her to classified missions across 3 continents, but she had never worked directly with SEAL teams in a training capacity. The brass had specifically requested her for this new pilot program designed to integrate advanced tactical communications and intelligence gathering into SEAL training curriculum. As she approached the main training building, Sarah noticed the curious glances from other instructors. She was one of only 3 female instructors on the entire base, and certainly the only one assigned to work directly with SEAL trainees. The weight of representing not just herself, but all women in naval special operations pressed heavily on her shoulders. The training coordinator, Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, met her at the building entrance. He was a weathered man in his 50s with eyes that had seen too much combat and a handshake that could crush walnuts. "Commander Mitchell, welcome to Coronado. Your reputation precedes you," he said with a slight smile. "The boys are going to be interesting today." Sarah had heard about the SEAL culture of testing new instructors, especially those who hadn't gone through their specific training pipeline. She expected skepticism, perhaps even some resistance. What she didn't expect was what Master Chief Rodriguez told her next. "Ma'am, we've got 12 rookies in today's class. Fresh out of BUD/S, thinks they're invincible. They've been asking questions about you since yesterday when they heard a new instructor was coming aboard. I may have let slip that you've got some interesting credentials, but I didn't give them any details about your rank or background." This was intentional, Sarah realized. The Master Chief wanted to see how the new SEALs would react to her without the immediate knowledge of her rank and experience. It was a test for both her and the trainees. The classroom was a stark, functional space with white walls covered in tactical diagrams and communication protocols. 12 young men, all in their early 20s, sat in metal chairs arranged in 2 rows. Their conversation died the moment Sarah entered the room. She could feel their eyes evaluating her, measuring her against their preconceived notions of what a special operations instructor should look like. Sarah placed her materials on the desk and turned to face the class. She wore standard Navy working uniforms with no visible rank insignia, as was common in many training environments to reduce formality and encourage open communication. The SEALs immediately began whispering among themselves, clearly trying to figure out who she was and what gave her the authority to instruct them. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm your new communications and intelligence instructor. Over the next 6 weeks, I'll be teaching you advanced tactical communications, intelligence gathering techniques, and information warfare strategies that will keep you and your teammates alive in hostile environments." One of the SEALs in the front row, a young man with close-cropped blonde hair and the build of a college wrestler, raised his hand. "Excuse me, ma'am, but what's your background? Have you been through SEAL training?" Sarah had expected this question. "No, I haven't been through SEAL training. My background is in naval intelligence and communications. I've spent the last 15 years in various classified assignments that have given me expertise in the areas I'll be teaching you." Another SEAL, this one with dark hair and a slight southern accent, chimed in. "With respect, ma'am, how can someone who hasn't been downrange with SEALs teach us what we need to know? No offense, but we need instructors who understand our world." The room grew tense. Sarah could see the other SEALs nodding in agreement with their classmates' sentiment. This was the moment she had prepared for, but it still stung. She understood their perspective. They had just completed some of the most brutal military training in the world, and now they were being asked to learn from someone who, in their minds, was an outsider. "I understand your concerns," Sarah replied calmly. "You've earned the right to question your instructors. That's part of what makes you special operators. You don't accept things at face value. But I would ask that you give me a chance to prove my value before dismissing what I have to offer." The blonde SEAL in the front row leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Fair enough, but we're going to need more than just theoretical knowledge. Can you tell us about a time when communications saved your life or the life of your team?" This was exactly what Sarah had hoped they would ask. She moved to the front of the desk and leaned against it casually. 3 years ago, I was embedded with a joint task force in Syria. We were conducting surveillance on a high-value target when our position was compromised. The team leader wanted to call for immediate extraction, but based on the communications intercepts I was monitoring, I knew there were hostile forces positioned along our primary and secondary evacuation routes. The room had grown completely silent. Even the SEALs who had been skeptical were now listening intently. I convinced the team leader to hold position for 40 minutes while I worked to establish communication with a nearby friendly unit that could create a diversion. During that time, I intercepted radio traffic indicating that the hostiles were planning to ambush any extraction attempt. By coordinating with the friendly unit and rerouting our extraction through a tertiary route that I identified through signals intelligence, we avoided contact with a force that outnumbered us 4-1. One of the SEALs in the back row, who had been silent until now, spoke up. How do we know that story is true? Anyone can make up war stories. Sarah smiled. This was exactly the kind of healthy skepticism she wanted from these operators. You don't know it's true, and you shouldn't take my word for it. But over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to teach you the skills that made that mission successful. You'll learn how to intercept and analyze enemy communications, how to coordinate with multiple units across different communication systems, and how to use information as a weapon. If my methods work for you, then you'll know my experience is real. The Southern SEAL who had spoken earlier raised his hand again. What rank are you, ma'am? We've been wondering since you walked in. Sarah paused. This was the moment Master Chief Rodriguez had set up, though she suspected he hadn't told the SEALs what kind of surprise they were in for. She could see the curiosity in their faces, the assumption that she was probably a lieutenant or lieutenant commander, respectable ranks, but not necessarily ones that would command their immediate respect for special operations instruction. That's an interesting question, Sarah said, moving to write something on the whiteboard behind her. Rank can be important in military hierarchies, but in special operations, competence and experience matter more than the number of stripes on your uniform. The blonde SEAL pressed the issue. With respect, ma'am, rank does matter. It tells us about your level of responsibility and experience in the Navy. If you're going to be our instructor, we have a right to know. Sarah finished writing on the board and turned back to face the class. She had written a single word, Admiral. The reaction was immediate and visible. Several SEALs sat up straighter in their chairs. Others looked confused, as if they hadn't heard correctly. The Southern SEAL who had been questioning her credentials looked like he had been hit with a brick. Gentlemen, meet Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell, Naval Intelligence. I earned my first star 2 months ago, which makes me the youngest female admiral in the current Navy and one of only 12 admirals currently serving who started their careers in enlisted ranks. The blonde SEAL's mouth was literally hanging open. The confident smirk had vanished completely, replaced by a look of shock that was almost comical. The room was so quiet that Sarah could hear the air conditioning unit humming in the corner. Now, Sarah continued, does anyone else have questions about my qualifications to be your instructor? The silence in the classroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. 12 of the most elite warriors in the world sat motionless, trying to process the fact that they had just spent the last 10 minutes questioning and challenging a Navy admiral. The weight of their behavior was sinking in, and the expressions on their faces ranged from embarrassment to outright panic. Admiral Mitchell let the moment hang in the air. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful teaching tool was silence. These young SEALs needed to understand not just who she was, but what their assumptions had cost them. More importantly, they needed to understand how those same assumptions could get them killed in the field. Finally, the Southern SEAL who had been most vocal in his skepticism slowly raised his hand. His face had gone completely pale. Admiral, ma'am, I think we owe you an apology. We had no idea. Sarah held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Seaman Henderson, right? She had memorized all their names and backgrounds before arriving. Tell me, what exactly are you apologizing for? Henderson looked confused by the question. For questioning your authority, ma'am. For being disrespectful to a superior officer. Were you being disrespectful? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Yes, ma'am. We should have shown proper military courtesy regardless of whether we knew your rank. Sarah moved away from the whiteboard and walked toward the center of the classroom. Actually, Henderson, I disagree. You were doing exactly what good special operators should do. You questioned someone who was asking you to trust them with your life. You demanded credentials and experience. You pushed back when something didn't make sense to you. Those are exactly the skills that will keep you alive in hostile territory. The blonde SEAL in the front row, whose name was Petty Officer Johnson, looked thoroughly confused. But, Admiral, we were insubordinate. We questioned your authority without knowing who you were. Sarah smiled. Johnson, let me ask you something. If you're in the field and someone approaches your team claiming to be friendly, do you just take their word for it because they're wearing the right uniform? No, ma'am. We verify identity through proper challenge and response protocols. Exactly. You don't assume someone is who they claim to be just because of how they look or what they're wearing. You verify. You question. You make them prove their credentials. Sarah paused, letting this sink in. So why should this classroom be any different? A SEAL in the back row named Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively. But, ma'am, military protocol requires us to show proper respect to superior officers. Rodriguez, you did show me respect. You called me ma'am. You raised your hands before speaking. You listened to my responses. But you also demanded that I earn your professional respect through demonstrated competence, not just assumed authority. That's exactly what I want from you. Sarah could see the confusion on their faces beginning to transform into something else. Understanding, perhaps even relief. She had turned what they thought was a massive mistake into a learning opportunity. Gentlemen, let me tell you something about special operations that they don't teach you in BUD/S. In the field, you're going to work with people from all branches of service, from allied militaries, from intelligence agencies, and from organizations you've never heard of. Some of them will outrank you significantly. Others will have no military rank at all, but possess skills and knowledge that could save your life. She moved to the window and looked out at the training grounds where other SEAL classes were running drills. Your ability to quickly assess the value of these people, regardless of their rank, their background, or their appearance, could mean the difference between mission success and mission failure, between coming home and not coming home. Johnson raised his hand again, more confidently this time. Admiral, are you saying that questioning authority is part of our job? I'm saying that intelligent questioning is part of your job. There's a difference between insubordination and professional skepticism. What you demonstrated here today was professional skepticism. You wanted to know if I could teach you something useful. You weren't satisfied with my title or my position. You wanted proof of competence. Sarah returned to the front of the classroom and leaned against the desk again. Now, let me tell you why that story I told you about Syria is relevant to this conversation. The team leader I was embedded with was a colonel with 15 years of special operations experience. I was a lieutenant commander with no special operations background. When I told him we needed to wait and change our extraction route, do you think he just accepted my recommendation because I asked nicely? Henderson shook his head. No, ma'am. I imagine he questioned your assessment. He absolutely did. He demanded that I explain my reasoning, show him the intelligence I was basing my decision on, and prove that my alternative plan was better than his. It took me 20 minutes of detailed explanation and raw data before he agreed to trust my judgment. And that skepticism, that refusal to accept my recommendation without proof, is exactly what made him a good team leader. The SEALs were starting to understand where she was going with this. Rodriguez spoke up again. So the fact that we question you means we're thinking like operators, not just following orders blindly. Exactly. But here's the other side of that coin. Sarah's tone became more serious. Once that colonel verified my credentials and accepted my plan, he trusted me completely. When I told him to move, he moved. When I told him to wait, he waited. When I told him to change direction, he changed direction. Because he had verified that I knew what I was talking about. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each SEAL. That's the balance you need to find in special operations. Question everything until you're satisfied with the answers. Then, trust completely once those questions are answered. Half-hearted trust gets people killed. Johnson raised his hand once more. Admiral, can you tell us more about your background? We understand now that we should have asked better questions instead of just assuming you weren't qualified. Sarah appreciated the request. These SEALs were learning to gather information properly instead of making assumptions. I enlisted in the Navy when I was 18, right out of high school in Ohio. My father was a factory worker, my mother was a nurse. I had no military connections, no special advantages. I started as a communications technician and spent my first 4 years on destroyers, learning how naval communications actually work in the real world. The room was completely attentive now. These young men, who had initially dismissed her, were hanging on every word. I was selected for officer training after my first enlistment and commissioned as an ensign. My first assignment as an officer was to a naval intelligence unit in Norfolk, where I learned that communications and intelligence are really two sides of the same coin. You can't gather good intelligence without understanding how information moves, and you can't communicate effectively without understanding the intelligence picture. Sarah moved to the whiteboard and began drawing a simple diagram. Over the next 15 years, I served in increasingly complex assignments. I was the communications officer on a submarine that conducted classified surveillance missions. I was the intelligence liaison to a Marine expeditionary unit during combat operations in Afghanistan. I commanded a naval communications station that provided support to special operations forces across the Pacific. She turned back to face the class. Each assignment taught me something new about how elite military units operate, how information moves in complex environments, and how small communication failures can have catastrophic consequences. Henderson raised his hand. Admiral, what made them select you for this instructor position? There must be other intelligence officers with similar experience. Good question. The Navy is experimenting with new approaches to special operations training. They want operators who understand not just tactics and weapons, but also information warfare, cyber operations, and intelligence analysis. The modern battlefield requires SEALs who can think beyond direct action missions. Sarah paused, considering how much to reveal about her specific qualifications. I was chosen for this position because I've spent the last 5 years developing new communication and intelligence protocols specifically for special operations forces. I've worked directly with SEAL teams, Delta Force, Marine Raiders, and other elite units to understand their unique requirements. Johnson looked genuinely curious now. Can you give us an example of how those protocols work in practice? This was exactly the kind of engagement Sarah had hoped for. Instead of challenging her authority, they were now asking substantive questions about her expertise. Last year, I worked with a SEAL team conducting a hostage rescue mission in Somalia. The traditional approach would have been to establish a communication plan before insertion and stick to it regardless of changing circumstances. But we developed adaptive protocols that allowed the team to modify their communication methods in real time based on the intelligence picture. The SEALs were clearly intrigued. Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair. How did that work, ma'am? Instead of using predetermined radio frequencies and call signs, the team was equipped with devices that could automatically adjust their communication methods based on detected threats. If enemy forces were monitoring certain frequencies, the system would automatically shift to alternative communication methods. If electronic warfare jamming was detected, the system would switch to entirely different technologies. Sarah could see the wheels turning in their heads. These were operators who understood the life and death importance of reliable communications. The result was that the team maintained constant contact with command and control throughout a 12-hour operation, even though enemy forces were actively trying to disrupt their communications. The Southern SEAL who had initially challenged her now looked genuinely excited. Admiral, that's exactly the kind of thing we need to learn. We've had missions where communication failures put the entire team at risk. That's precisely why I'm here, Sarah replied. To teach you not just how to use communication equipment, but how to think about information as a weapon system, how to use intelligence as a force multiplier, how to turn your ability to gather and analyze information into a tactical advantage. She looked around the room one more time, noting how dramatically the atmosphere had changed in just 30 minutes. Now, does anyone have any other questions about my qualifications to be your instructor? The room remained silent, but this time it was the silence of respect rather than confusion. These 12 young SEALs had just learned their first lesson about assumptions, authority, and the importance of asking the right questions. More importantly, they had learned that their new instructor was someone who could teach them skills that might save their lives. Admiral Sarah Mitchell smiled and picked up her lesson plan. Excellent. Let's begin. 2 weeks had passed since Admiral Mitchell's dramatic introduction to the SEAL trainees. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grudging respect that was slowly transforming into genuine admiration. The SEALs had discovered that their new instructor possessed not only impressive credentials, but also practical knowledge that directly applied to their missions. However, respect earned in a classroom was different from respect earned in the field. Admiral Mitchell knew that these young operators would not fully trust her until she proved herself under pressure. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Master Chief Rodriguez appeared in the doorway of Mitchell's office on a Tuesday morning, his expression grim. Admiral, we've got a situation. One of our advanced SEAL teams has gone dark during a training exercise off the coast of San Diego. Last communication was 6 hours ago, and we've lost all contact. Admiral Mitchell looked up from the intelligence reports she had been reviewing. What's the nature of the exercise? Maritime infiltration and surveillance. Team of 8 SEALs conducting reconnaissance on a simulated enemy facility. They were supposed to maintain communication every 2 hours, but We've heard nothing since their initial insertion report. Mitchell stood and reached for her gear. What assets do we have available for search and rescue? Master Chief Rodriguez shook his head. That's the problem, Admiral. Our primary rescue helicopter is down for maintenance, and the backup crew is dealing with a medical emergency on another training exercise. We're looking at least 4 hours before we can get proper search and rescue assets in the water. What about the Coast Guard? Already contacted. They're dealing with a commercial fishing vessel in distress about 50 miles out. They can redirect resources to us, but it'll take time. Admiral Mitchell was already moving toward the door. Master Chief, gather my SEAL trainees. All 12 of them. Have them meet me at the boat dock in 15 minutes, full gear. Rodriguez looked surprised. Admiral, those are rookies. They just finished BUD/S. Are you sure you want to use them for an actual search and rescue operation? Master Chief, those rookies are still SEALs. More importantly, this is exactly the kind of situation where my communication and intelligence skills might make the difference between finding that team and losing them. 15 minutes later, 12 young SEALs stood at attention on the dock, their faces a mixture of excitement and nervousness. They had expected another classroom session. Instead, they found themselves being briefed for their first real-world operation. Admiral Mitchell stood before them in full tactical gear, looking every inch the Special Operations leader. Gentlemen, we have 8 of your fellow SEALs who went dark during a training exercise. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and our primary search and rescue assets are unavailable. You are now the primary response team. Johnson, the blonde SEAL who had initially challenged her authority, raised his hand. Admiral, what exactly is our mission? Our mission is to locate and extract the missing team using advanced communication and intelligence techniques that I'm going to teach you in real time. This is not a simulation. This is not a training exercise. This is the real thing. Henderson, the Southern SEAL, looked concerned. Admiral, we don't have experience with actual search and rescue operations. What if we make things worse? Henderson, what did we learn about assumptions 2 weeks ago? That we shouldn't make them without proper information, ma'am. Correct. So what assumptions are you making about your abilities right now? Henderson thought for a moment. That we're not qualified for this mission because we're rookies. And what information are you basing that assumption on? The fact that we just finished basic training and haven't done real operations before. Admiral Mitchell smiled. Henderson, you've been through some of the most demanding military training in the world. You're qualified to conduct underwater demolition, close quarters combat, and high-altitude parachute insertions. Do you really think you're not qualified to help search for a missing team? The realization dawned on Henderson's face. No, ma'am. We're probably more qualified than most people who would be doing this job. Exactly. Now, let me explain how we're going to approach this differently than a conventional search and rescue operation. Admiral Mitchell moved to a portable whiteboard that had been set up on the dock. Traditional SAR operations rely primarily on visual search patterns and radio communication attempts. We're going to use intelligence analysis and advanced communication techniques to narrow our search area before we ever get in the water. She began drawing a map of the coastal area where the missing team was last reported. Rodriguez, what specific intelligence do we have about the missing team's mission? They were conducting surveillance on a simulated enemy facility located on this small island. Rodriguez pointed to a spot on the map. Their insertion point was here, about 2 miles offshore. They were using rigid inflatable boats for transportation. Admiral Mitchell turned to her SEAL trainees. Johnson, based on what you know about maritime operations, what factors could cause a team to lose communication? Johnson thought carefully before answering. Equipment failure, enemy action simulation that they took too seriously, weather conditions, or geographical interference with radio signals. Good analysis. Rodriguez, what about weather conditions during the time they went dark? Fog rolled in about 3 hours after their insertion. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. That's when we started losing intermittent contact. Admiral Mitchell turned to another trainee. Kowalski, if you were a SEAL team leader and found yourself in heavy fog with communication problems, what would be your likely course of action? Petty Officer Kowalski, a quiet SEAL who had spoken very little during classroom sessions, considered the question. Ma'am, I would probably try to establish communication from higher ground or move to a predetermined rally point where extraction could be coordinated. Excellent. That's exactly the kind of tactical thinking that will help us find this team. Admiral Mitchell turned back to the map. Now let's analyze this systematically. If the team is following proper protocols, they would move to one of several likely positions. She began marking locations on the map. Primary rally point would be their original insertion area. Secondary would be the highest ground on the island. Tertiary would be the lee side of the island, protected from weather. Henderson raised his hand. Admiral, how do we know they're not just hiding and maintaining radio silence as part of the exercise? Good question. Rodriguez, what were the communication protocols for this exercise? They were supposed to maintain contact regardless of exercise parameters. Safety communication always takes priority over training realism. Admiral Mitchell nodded. Which means if they haven't communicated, it's because they can't, not because they're choosing not to. She turned to address all the SEALs. This is lesson 1 in intelligence analysis, gentlemen. Always distinguish between what people can't do and what they choose not to do. She moved to a laptop computer that had been connected to several different communication devices. Now I'm going to show you how to use signals intelligence to locate missing personnel. Rodriguez, do we have the frequency assignments for the missing team? Yes, ma'am. Primary and secondary frequencies, plus emergency backup. Perfect. Kowalski, I want you to monitor their primary frequency while I configure this direction-finding equipment. Johnson, you monitor the emergency frequency. Henderson, you're going to help me analyze terrain and weather data to predict where they're most likely to be. The SEALs moved into action with the efficiency that had been drilled into them during training. What impressed Admiral Mitchell was how quickly they adapted to using intelligence techniques they had never been formally trained on. Admiral, Kowalski called out after several minutes of monitoring. I'm getting something on the primary frequency. It's very weak, but it sounds like voice traffic. Admiral Mitchell moved quickly to his position. Can you clean up the signal? Try adjusting the gain and squelch settings. After a few moments of fine-tuning, a faint voice became audible through the static. Anyone listening, position approximately need assistance with. That's them, Rodriguez said grimly. But the signal is too weak to get their location or understand their situation. Admiral Mitchell was already working with the direction-finding equipment. The signal is coming from approximately 0.45 degrees from our position. Based on signal strength, they're probably 8 to 10 miles out. She turned to the map and drew a line in the direction indicated by the equipment. Henderson, based on your terrain analysis, where along this bearing would they be most likely to take shelter? Henderson studied the map carefully. There are 3 small islands along that line, Admiral. The largest one has elevation that would provide both shelter and a good position for radio communication. Johnson, what's the distance to that island by boat? Approximately 12 miles, ma'am. With current sea conditions, probably 35 to 40 minutes in a fast boat. Admiral Mitchell made her decision. We're going after them. Kowalski, you'll continue monitoring communications and try to establish contact. Henderson, you'll navigate using GPS and compass backup. Johnson, you'll coordinate with the boat crew. The rest of you will prepare for possible water rescue operations. As they boarded the high-speed rescue boat, Rodriguez pulled Admiral Mitchell aside. Admiral, I have to ask, are you sure about using these rookies for this? If something goes wrong. Master Chief, those rookies just conducted a textbook intelligence analysis in less than 30 minutes. They've identified the most likely location of our missing team using techniques that most SAR crews have never heard of. I'm not worried about their qualifications anymore. The boat pulled away from the dock, heading into increasingly rough seas and deteriorating weather conditions. In the passenger compartment, 12 young SEALs prepared for their first real-world mission, led by an admiral who was about to prove that intelligence and communication skills could be just as valuable as physical prowess in special operations. As they headed into the fog, Admiral Mitchell reflected on how much had changed since that first day in the classroom. These young SEALs had learned to look beyond assumptions and trust in demonstrated competence rather than rank or appearance. Now it was time to see if those lessons would translate into saving lives. The radio crackled again with the faint voice of the missing team leader. Any station, this is SEAL Team 7. We have casualties and need immediate extraction. Admiral Mitchell grabbed the microphone. SEAL Team 7, this is Rescue 1. We have your approximate location and are en route. Estimate arrival in 25 minutes. The relief in the team leader's voice was audible even through the static. Rescue 1, be advised we have 2 casualties, 1 serious. We're located on the north side of Bell Island, approximately 100 meters inland from the beach. Johnson looked up from the map with surprise. Admiral, that's exactly where we predicted they would be. Admiral Mitchell smiled grimly as she watched the GPS display showing their approach to Bell Island. Johnson, that's not luck. That's what happens when you use intelligence properly. The rescue boat cut through increasingly choppy waters as it approached Bell Island. Visibility had dropped to less than 30 yards due to the thick fog, and the weather was continuing to deteriorate. Admiral Mitchell stood in the bow with Johnson, using portable radar to navigate through the hazardous conditions. Admiral, Kowalski called from his communication station. I'm picking up additional radio traffic on military frequencies. It sounds like multiple units conducting the same type of training exercise. Admiral Mitchell frowned. This was unexpected. Can you identify the units? Negative, ma'am. But, based on the communication protocols, they appear to be simulating enemy forces as part of the training scenario. Rodriguez, who was monitoring the tactical situation, looked up with concern. Admiral, if there are opposing force units in the area, this rescue just became significantly more complicated. Admiral Mitchell quickly assessed the situation. The missing SEAL team had casualties and needed immediate extraction, but extracting them in the presence of opposing force units would turn the rescue into a tactical operation. Her rookie SEALs were about to get their first taste of real-world complexity. Henderson, how far are we from the reported position of the missing team? Approximately 8 minutes at current speed, Admiral. Kowalski, try to establish direct communication with SEAL Team 7. I need to know their exact tactical situation. After several minutes of attempts, Kowalski managed to establish a weak, but clear connection. SEAL Team 7, this is Rescue 1. Can you provide details on your casualties and current tactical situation? The voice that came back was strained, but professional. Rescue 1, this is Team 7 Actual. We have one SEAL with a compound fracture of the left leg, another with severe hypothermia. Both casualties occurred during infiltration when our boat hit submerged rocks in the fog. Admiral Mitchell took the microphone. Team 7 Actual, this is Rescue 1 Actual. Are you currently engaged with opposing forces? Negative, Rescue 1. But we've been monitoring OPFOR communications for the last hour. They're conducting search patterns in our general area. We've been maintaining concealment to avoid compromising the exercise, but our casualties are getting worse. This was exactly the kind of complex situation that separated good special operators from great ones. Admiral Mitchell turned to address her SEAL trainees. Gentlemen, we now have a tactical problem in addition to a rescue problem. We need to extract casualties while avoiding detection by opposing forces who don't know this has become a real emergency. Johnson raised his hand. Admiral, shouldn't we just contact the exercise controllers and have them halt the training scenario? Excellent question, Johnson. That would be the safe, easy solution. But what if this were a real combat situation? What if those weren't training opposing forces, but actual enemy units? The realization dawned on the young SEALs that this was as much a training opportunity as it was a rescue mission. Admiral Mitchell was teaching them how to handle the kind of complex, multi-layered challenges they would face in actual operations. Henderson, I want you to analyze the terrain around the extraction point. How would you approach if you were trying to avoid detection? Henderson moved to study the nautical charts and GPS display. The north side of the island where the team is located has a small cove that's protected from observation by the main body of the island. If we approach from the northeast, we can use the terrain to mask our approach. Good analysis. Kowalski, what information can you gather about the opposing force positions based on their radio communications? Kowalski had been monitoring multiple frequencies while the team discussed tactics. Admiral, based on their communication patterns, I believe there are at least 2 OPFOR units. One appears to be conducting a maritime patrol about 3 miles south of our position. The other seems to be conducting land-based reconnaissance on the eastern side of the island. Admiral Mitchell was impressed by how quickly her trainees were adapting to real-world intelligence gathering. Outstanding work. Now, how do we use this information to plan our approach? Another SEAL, Petty Officer Davis, who had been quiet during most of their training, spoke up. Ma'am, if we time our approach to coincide with the maritime patrol moving away from our position, and we use the terrain to avoid the land-based unit, we should be able to extract the team without being detected. Davis, that's excellent tactical thinking. But there's one more factor we need to consider. Admiral Mitchell pointed to the weather display on the boat's instruments. This fog is going to lift in approximately 30 minutes. Once visibility improves, our concealment advantage disappears. The SEALs quickly understood the time pressure they were under. Rodriguez checked his watch. Admiral, that gives us a very narrow window to complete the extraction. Exactly. Which means we need to execute this perfectly the first time. Admiral Mitchell turned to address the entire team. I'm going to divide you into two elements. Johnson, Henderson, Davis, and Kowalski will come ashore with me to locate and treat the casualties. The remaining 8 SEALs will provide security and prepare the boat for rapid extraction. As they approached the island, the tension was palpable. These young SEALs were experiencing their first real-world application of everything they had learned in training. Admiral Mitchell could see the focus and determination in their faces as they prepared for what could become a very complex operation. Kowalski, one more communication check with the missing team. Team 7 Actual, this is Rescue 1. We are approaching your position from the northeast. Can you guide us to your exact location? Rescue 1, we can hear your boat engines. We're approximately 100 meters inland from the small cove on the north side. Be advised, we've detected OPFOR movement about 500 meters to our east. They appear to be conducting a search pattern. Admiral Mitchell made a quick decision. Team 7, can you move your casualties to a position closer to the beach without compromising their medical condition? Negative, Rescue 1. The SEAL with the compound fracture cannot be moved without proper stabilization equipment. This meant the shore team would have to move inland to reach the casualties, significantly increasing their exposure time and risk of detection. Admiral Mitchell looked at her 4-person shore team. Gentlemen, we're about to conduct a tactical casualty evacuation in the presence of opposing forces. Everything you've learned about stealth, medical treatment, and tactical movement is about to be put to the test. The boat slipped quietly into the small cove, its engines barely audible above the sound of waves against the rocky shore. Admiral Mitchell and her 4 SEALs moved quickly but silently onto the beach, carrying medical equipment and an improvised stretcher. Henderson, you navigate to the casualty position. Davis and Kowalski, you provide security. Johnson, you're with me. We'll assess and treat the casualties. Moving through the dense vegetation of the island, the team made their way inland using hand signals and tactical movement techniques. Admiral Mitchell was impressed by how naturally the young SEALs applied their training to the real situation. After 10 minutes of careful movement, they reached the position where SEAL Team 7 was concealed. What they found was 2 experienced SEALs trying to manage serious medical emergencies with limited equipment in challenging conditions. The SEAL with the compound fracture was in significant pain, and the fracture had created an open wound that was bleeding steadily. The SEAL with hypothermia was semi-conscious and showing signs of severe exposure. Admiral Mitchell immediately took charge of the medical situation. Johnson, start in 4 on the hypothermia patient and begin warming protocols. I'll handle the fracture stabilization. As they worked to stabilize the casualties, Henderson kept watch and Kowalski continued monitoring enemy communications. Admiral, Kowalski whispered urgently. OPFOR communications indicate they're moving closer to this position. Estimate they'll be within 200 meters in about 10 minutes. Admiral Mitchell looked up from the fracture she was splinting. Henderson, what's the fastest route back to the beach that avoids the eastern approach? There's a dry creek bed that runs directly from here to the cove. It provides concealment, but it's going to be difficult to carry stretchers through that terrain. Davis, help me get this casualty secured on the stretcher. Johnson, how's your patient? Core temperature is slowly improving, Admiral. He's conscious and can probably walk with assistance. Outstanding. We move in 2 minutes. The extraction became a masterclass in tactical casualty evacuation. The SEALs moved quickly but carefully through the difficult terrain, carrying their wounded teammates while maintaining security and avoiding detection by the opposing forces that were searching the area. As they reached the beach, Kowalski reported that the OPFOR units were less than 100 meters from their previous position. They had missed detection by minutes. Loading the casualties onto the boat, Admiral Mitchell felt a surge of pride, watching her SEAL trainees perform like seasoned operators. They had successfully completed a complex mission under pressure, demonstrating not just physical skills, but also tactical thinking and adaptability. As the boat pulled away from the island, Rodriguez came over to Admiral Mitchell. Admiral, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've never seen rookie SEALs perform like that. They executed that mission like veterans. Admiral Mitchell watched her trainees as they provided continued medical care to the casualties during the boat ride back to base. Master Chief, they performed like veterans because they were thinking like veterans. They weren't just following orders. They were analyzing the situation, adapting to changing conditions, and making smart decisions. Johnson approached as they neared the base. Admiral, that was nothing like what we expected when we started your class 2 weeks ago. Johnson, what did you learn from this operation that you couldn't have learned in a classroom? Johnson thought for a moment. That intelligence and communications aren't just support functions, they're combat capabilities. The reason we found the missing team and avoided the opposing forces was because we used information as a weapon. Admiral Mitchell smiled. Exactly. And that, gentlemen, is why you needed an instructor who understands both intelligence operations and special operations. Because in the real world, they're not separate things, they're integrated parts of the same mission. As the boat docked and the casualties were transferred to waiting ambulances, Admiral Mitchell realized that her SEAL trainees had just proven something important to themselves. They had demonstrated that they could handle complex, real-world missions when they combined their physical training with advanced thinking skills. More importantly, they had learned to trust not just their own abilities, but also the judgment of an instructor who had proven her value under fire. The questioning and skepticism from their first day had been replaced by the kind of professional respect that came from shared success in dangerous situations. The rookies were starting to become SEALs. 6 weeks after the rescue mission, Admiral Mitchell stood before her SEAL trainees for their final examination. The classroom looked the same as it had on that first day when they had challenged her authority, but everything else had changed. The 12 young men who sat before her had been transformed from skeptical rookies into confident operators who understood the power of intelligence and communications in special operations. The final exam was unlike anything they had experienced in their military training. Instead of a written test or physical challenge, Admiral Mitchell had designed a comprehensive exercise that would test their ability to integrate everything they had learned about intelligence gathering, communication techniques, and tactical analysis. Gentlemen, Admiral Mitchell began, your final examination will be a real-world intelligence and communication mission. You will be divided into 3 four-man teams and given separate assignments that are interconnected. Success will depend not just on your individual team's performance, but on your ability to coordinate and share information across all 3 teams. Johnson raised his hand. Admiral, are we going to know what the other team's missions are? Excellent question, Johnson. Each team will receive only the information necessary for their specific assignment. Just like real operations, you'll need to piece together the big picture through communication and intelligence sharing. Admiral Mitchell moved to 3 sealed envelopes on her desk. Team Alpha will consist of Johnson, Henderson, Davis, and Rodriguez. Team Bravo will be Kowalski, Peterson, Williams, and Torres. Team Charlie will be McKenzie, Thompson, Sanchez, and Murphy. She handed each team leader a sealed envelope. Inside these envelopes, you'll find your mission parameters, communication frequencies, and initial intelligence. You have 4 hours to complete your assignments. The clock starts now. Team Alpha opened their envelope to find a mission that seemed straightforward. Conduct surveillance on a suspected arms dealer operating out of a waterfront warehouse in San Diego Harbor. Their job was to gather intelligence on his activities and identify his associates. Team Bravo received what appeared to be a completely different assignment. Investigate unusual communication traffic that intelligence analysts had detected coming from several locations around San Diego. They were to identify the source and nature of the communications. Team Charlie's mission seemed unrelated to the others. Conduct background investigations on 3 individuals who had recently applied for security clearances to work on classified Navy projects. What none of the teams initially realized was that Admiral Mitchell had designed an exercise that mirrored the complexity of real-world intelligence operations, where different agencies and units often work on pieces of the same puzzle without knowing how their missions connect. Team Alpha began their surveillance operation with the systematic approach that Admiral Mitchell had taught them. Instead of simply watching the warehouse, they started by analyzing the target's communication patterns, financial records, and known associates. Johnson, Henderson said as they reviewed the intelligence package, this arms dealer has communication patterns that seem unusual. He's using encrypted cell phones, but the timing of his calls corresponds with maritime traffic in the harbor. What kind of maritime traffic? Johnson asked. Davis, who had become the team's specialist in signals intelligence, was monitoring electronic communications. I'm detecting encrypted radio transmissions from several vessels in the harbor. The timing matches what Henderson noticed about the cell phone calls. Rodriguez, the team's surveillance specialist, had been watching the warehouse through binoculars. There's definitely activity here, but it's not what I expected from an arms dealer. These people look more like technicians than criminals. Meanwhile, Team Bravo was struggling with their communication intercept mission. The signals they were supposed to investigate were sophisticated and well encrypted. Kowalski, who had become expert at communication analysis, was trying to identify patterns in the transmission timing and frequencies. Peterson, these aren't criminal communications, Kowalski said after an hour of analysis. The encryption methods and transmission protocols look military or government. Williams had been tracking the physical locations of the transmission sources. The signals are coming from the harbor area, from several locations downtown, and from what appears to be a government building. Torres, who specialized in technical analysis, made a connection. Wait, if these are government communications, why were we asked to investigate them? Unless they're not supposed to be happening, Peterson finished. Or unless they're part of something larger that we're supposed to figure out. Team Charlie was conducting their background investigations using techniques that Admiral Mitchell had taught them about open-source intelligence gathering. They quickly discovered that the 3 individuals they were investigating had some interesting connections. McKinsey found that one of the subjects had recently returned from overseas military service and was applying for a job as a harbor security specialist. Thompson discovered that another subject was a communication technician with access to military radio equipment. Sanchez found that the third subject was a Navy intelligence analyst who had been asking questions about warehouse security in the San Diego area. Murphy, McKinsey said, these aren't random people applying for security clearances. These backgrounds are too specific and too connected to be a coincidence. Murphy was analyzing the timeline of events. All 3 of these people submitted their applications within a week of each other, and they all have skills related to harbor operations, communications, and intelligence. After 2 hours, Team Alpha made the first breakthrough. Johnson realized that their surveillance target wasn't actually an arms dealer, but a Navy intelligence operative conducting a training exercise. Henderson, look at this. Our supposed arms dealer is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun from Naval Intelligence. This whole operation is a simulation. Henderson looked at the identification they had managed to obtain through careful observation. If this is a training exercise, then what we're really doing is testing our ability to identify and track friendly intelligence operatives. Davis had continued monitoring communications. That would explain the sophisticated encryption and the coordination with maritime assets. This is a Navy operation. Rodriguez made the connection that brought everything together. If this is a training exercise designed to test our surveillance capabilities, then the other teams are probably working on related parts of the same scenario. Team Alpha immediately attempted to contact the other teams to share their discovery. But when they tried to reach Team Bravo on their assigned frequency, they found the communication channel was being jammed. Team Bravo was experiencing their own revelations. Kowalski had managed to partially decrypt some of the communications they were monitoring. These are definitely Navy communications, but they're discussing counter-surveillance operations. Peterson understood the implications. If they're conducting counter-surveillance, and we're supposed to be intercepting their communications, then this is a test of our ability to gather intelligence while being actively opposed by professionals. Williams had been tracking the movement of personnel associated with the communication sources. I'm seeing coordination between the people we're monitoring and maritime units in the harbor. This looks like a comprehensive training exercise. Torres made the crucial connection. If this is a training exercise, then we're not just supposed to intercept communications. We're supposed to figure out the whole operation and coordinate with the other teams. Team Charlie reached similar conclusions through their background investigations. McKinsey realized that the 3 individuals they were investigating were all current Navy personnel who were likely participants in the same exercise. These people aren't applying for security clearances, Thompson said. They're playing roles in a training scenario designed to test our investigative techniques. Sanchez had been analyzing the connections between the 3 subjects. All 3 have skills that would be necessary for the kind of operation that Teams Alpha and Bravo are investigating. Murphy put together the final piece. This isn't 3 separate missions. This is one integrated exercise designed to test our ability to work together and share intelligence across team boundaries. The breakthrough came when Team Charlie managed to establish communication with Team Alpha using alternative frequencies that Admiral Mitchell had taught them as backup protocols. When Johnson learned about the background investigations Team Charlie was conducting, he immediately understood the connection. Teams Bravo and Charlie, this is Team Alpha. We believe all 3 of our missions are parts of a single training exercise. Recommend immediate coordination meeting to share intelligence. Despite the communication jamming affecting their primary frequencies, the teams managed to coordinate using the redundant communication methods Admiral Mitchell had taught them. They agreed to meet at a central location to pool their intelligence and develop a comprehensive picture of the exercise. When the three teams combined their information, the full scope of Admiral Mitchell's final exam became clear. She had created a complex scenario that required them to use every skill they had learned: surveillance, communication intercept, background investigation, signals intelligence, and, most importantly, inter-team coordination. "This is brilliant," Kowalski said as they reviewed all the intelligence they had gathered. "She designed an exercise that we could only solve by working together and thinking beyond our individual assignments." Johnson looked at his watch. They had been working for 3 hours and had 1 hour remaining. "Now that we understand what we're really doing, we need to present our findings in a way that demonstrates we've solved the entire puzzle." The team spent their final hour preparing a comprehensive briefing that showed how all three missions connected to create a single, integrated intelligence picture. They identified all the participants in the exercise, mapped their communication networks, and demonstrated their understanding of the training objectives. When Admiral Mitchell called them back to the classroom, she found 12 confident SEALs ready to present their analysis. The transformation from that first day was remarkable. These young operators had learned to think like intelligence professionals while maintaining their tactical mindset. "Teams Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie," Admiral Mitchell said, "please present your findings." Johnson stood to brief for all three teams. "Admiral, after initial independent operations, we determined that our 3 separate missions were actually components of a single integrated training exercise. Through coordinated intelligence sharing and analysis, we identified that the exercise was designed to test our ability to conduct surveillance, communication intercept, and background investigations while adapting to active countermeasures." He moved to the whiteboard and began drawing connections between the different elements they had discovered. Team Alpha identified that the surveillance target was Lieutenant Commander Chun conducting counter-surveillance training. Team Bravo determined that the communication intercepts were Navy operational traffic with active jamming components. Team Charlie established that the background investigation subjects were Navy personnel playing roles in the exercise. Henderson continued the briefing. "The key breakthrough came when we realized that success required inter-team coordination using backup communication protocols you taught us. This exercise tested not just our individual technical skills, but our ability to adapt, improvise, and work together when standard procedures were disrupted." Admiral Mitchell listened with obvious pride as the teams presented their analysis. They had not only solved the exercise, but had also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how intelligence operations work in the real world. "Outstanding work," Admiral Mitchell said when they finished their presentation. "You've just completed an exercise based on an actual multi-agency intelligence operation I participated in last year. The scenario, the techniques, and the challenges you faced were all drawn from real-world experience." Davis raised his hand. "Admiral, was the entire exercise designed to test our ability to work together?" "Davis, that was part of it. But, more importantly, it was designed to test your ability to recognize when individual missions are actually parts of larger operations. In the real world, you'll often be given assignments that seem isolated but are actually connected to broader strategic objectives." Admiral Mitchell looked around the room at the 12 SEALs who had started as skeptical rookies and had developed into sophisticated operators. "What you've learned over the past 6 weeks goes far beyond communication techniques and intelligence gathering. You've learned to think systematically, to question assumptions, to adapt to changing conditions, and to trust in your own analytical abilities." Rodriguez raised his hand. "Admiral, when we first met you, we thought intelligence and communications were support functions. Now we understand they're actually combat capabilities." "Rodriguez, that's exactly right. In modern special operations, your ability to gather, analyze, and act on information is often more important than your ability to shoot accurately or run fast. The enemies you'll face in the real world will be defeated through superior intelligence and communication, not just superior firepower." Admiral Mitchell moved to the whiteboard and wrote a single word: respect. "Gentlemen, when I walked into this classroom 6 weeks ago, you challenged my authority because you didn't know who I was. You questioned my credentials because they weren't immediately obvious. You demanded that I prove my value because you weren't willing to accept claims without evidence." She turned to face them. Those were exactly the right reactions. You demonstrated professional skepticism, critical thinking, and unwillingness to accept authority without justification. Those same qualities made you successful in today's exercise, and will make you successful in real operations. Johnson raised his hand. Admiral, we learned something else important. We learned that respect has to be earned through demonstrated competence, not just assumed because of rank or position. Johnson, that's the most important lesson of all. In special operations, you'll work with people from many different backgrounds, with different ranks, different skills, and different experiences. Your ability to quickly assess their value and integrate their capabilities with your own will often determine mission success. Admiral Mitchell picked up a folder from her desk. I have one final announcement. Based on your performance over the past 6 weeks, I've recommended all 12 of you for immediate assignment to operational SEAL teams. You've demonstrated not just technical competence, but also the kind of analytical thinking and adaptability that makes great special operators. The classroom erupted in grins and quiet congratulations. These young SEALs had not only completed their training but had earned the respect of one of the Navy's most senior intelligence officers. Admiral, Henderson said, we want to thank you for teaching us to think differently about intelligence and communications. But more than that, we want to thank you for teaching us to think. Admiral Mitchell smiled as she looked at the 12 SEALs who had challenged her authority on that first day and had now become sophisticated operators ready for real-world missions. They had learned that assumptions could be dangerous, that competence was more important than rank, and that intelligence and communications were weapon systems just as important as any rifle or explosive device. Gentlemen, it's been my honor to be your instructor. Now go forth and use what you've learned to keep yourselves and your teammates alive. And remember, never stop questioning, never stop learning, and never stop thinking. As the SEALs filed out of the classroom, Admiral Mitchell reflected on how much they had all learned over the past 6 weeks. The rookies had become operators, and she had discovered that teaching could be just as rewarding as commanding. Master Chief Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. Admiral, I've got your next class of 12 SEAL trainees arriving next week. Word has gotten around about what you accomplished with this group. These new ones are already asking questions about their instructor. Admiral Mitchell smiled. What kind of questions, Master Chief? Well, ma'am, they want to know if it's true that their instructor is some kind of communications specialist who's never been in combat. Admiral Mitchell laughed. I see. And what did you tell them? I told them they'd find out soon enough, Admiral. I told them they'd find out soon enough.